Hi again. John Stott in The Spirit, the Church, and the World, the Message of Acts. We've reached page 317, and John Stott is now talking about the journey of Paul to Jerusalem and the stops along the way. At this point, Luke interrupts his narrative in order to tell us who Paul's traveling companions were. It's noteworthy that Paul hardly ever traveled alone, and that when he was alone, he expressed his longing for human companionship, for example, in Athens and in his final Roman imprisonment. That he favored teamwork is especially clear during his missionary journeys. On his first, he was accompanied by Barnabas and John Mark, until the latter defected. On his second, by Silas and later Timothy, then Luke, and now at the end of his third, Luke supplies his readers with a list of Paul's friends. He was accompanied by Sopater, perhaps the same as the Sosipater, who in Romans 16:21 is called one of Paul's relatives, son of Pyrrhus from Berea, Aristarchus, and Secundus from Thessalonica, Gaius from Derbe, probably the same as in Acts 19:29, where one reading makes only Aristarchus a Macedonian, not Gaius. Timothy also, Tychicus, and Trophimus from the province of Asia. Trophimus came from Ephesus. Perhaps Tychicus did also. In most cases, Luke supplies these men's home as well as their name in order both to identify them clearly and also probably to indicate how they represented the different regions which were taking part in the collection. Thus, Macedonia was represented by Sopater, Berea, Aristarchus and Secundus from Thessalonica, and perhaps Luke himself from Philippi, Galatia by Gaius, that is from Derbe, and Timothy from Lystra, and Asia by Tychicus and Trophimus from Ephesus. Achaia is missing, but could have been represented by Paul himself and or by Titus, who according to Ramsey's conjecture was a relative of Luke's. This would mean that Paul's entourage consisted of at least 9 men. Luke does not actually mention the offering in connection with them, although it must have been in his mind. In our minds, as we reflect on Paul's associates, should be the threefold witness which they bear. The first is to the growth, unity, and even, one might say, Catholicity of the church. Already Christian leaders from inland and coastal Asia Minor, from both sides of the Aegean, and from the northern and southern halves of Greece, know that they belong to the same church and in consequence cooperate in the same cause. Secondly, they bear witness to the fruitfulness of Paul's missionary expeditions, since Derbe and Lystra were evangelized during his first, Berea and Thessalonica during his second, and Ephesus during his third. All 9 men must have been the fruits of mission, but they then became the agents of mission. For thirdly, they give evidence of the missionary mindedness of the young Christian communities, which already gave up some of their best local leadership to the wider work and witness of Christ's church. Reading between the lines of Luke's compressed narrative, it seems that Paul and his group of associates left Corinth together and reached Philippi together. Perhaps it was here, and not earlier, that Luke joined the party, since the previous we section left him there, that is Acts 16:12, and the next we section begins now in chapter 20, verse 5. Here too, the group apparently split into 2. These men, at least 7 or 8 of them, went on ahead and waited for us at Troas, according to verse 5. But we, just Paul and Luke, sailed from Philippi, that is, from its port Neapolis, only after the Feast of Unleavened Bread. This is unlikely to be a purely chronological note, nor is Luke clearly saying that, having been foiled in his desire to celebrate the Passover in Jerusalem, Paul celebrated it in Philippi instead. Are we sure that he continued to observe the Jewish feasts, even though for a particular purpose he intended to get to Jerusalem in time for Pentecost? I prefer Professor Howard Marshall's explanation. Quote, "It is probable that he was celebrating the Christian Passover, that is, Easter, with the church at Philippi." At all events, it was not until after the festival that they left Philippi, and then it was 5 days later that they joined the others at Troas. They must have encountered strong headwinds, for their voyage in the opposite direction had taken only 2 days. Once in Troas, however, they stayed 7 days. So here's the week in Troas. That's chapter 20, verses 7 to 12. Luke records only one incident during this week in Troas, namely the dramatic sleep, fall, death, and resuscitation of a young man called Eutychus. Because it took place in the context of a worship service, however, the story is also instructive in the area of early Christian worship. On the first day of the week we came together to break bread, according to verse 7. How we interpret this first day depends on whether we think Luke followed the Jewish reckoning of a day from sunset to sunset, or the Roman from midnight to midnight. It is because the New English Bible translators opted for the former that they rendered the opening expression on the Saturday night. And certainly the Bazin text of 19 verse 9, from the 5th hour to the 10th, that is from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m., is a Jewish calculation, with the day beginning at 6 a.m. But here Luke is following the Roman way of reckoning, since the daylight of verse 11 is already the next day of verse 7. Professor Bruce, that is F.F. Bruce, is surely right, therefore, that Luke's reference to the first day of the week, that is Sunday, is the earliest unambiguous evidence we have for the Christian practice of gathering together for worship on that day. Moreover, the purpose of their assembly was to break bread, which Luke understood as the Lord's Supper in the context of a fellowship meal, as in the upper room in Jerusalem. In addition, Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, kept on talking until midnight. Luke was himself present on this occasion. He says, we came together, in verse 7, and where we were meeting, verse 8, so that he was able to supply several eyewitness details which help us to visualize the scene. First, it was an evening service or meeting, for if Paul's address ended at midnight, it can hardly have begun at midday. So it probably began at about sunset, the congregation assembling for worship at the conclusion of their day's work. Next, the meeting was being held in a private house, upstairs, according to verse 8. Indeed, on the third floor, verse 9 indicates. Thirdly, there were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting, so that the atmosphere became stuffy and oily, even for Eutychus, who was seated in a window. The New English Bible says there in verse 9 that he was sitting on a window ledge, which being unglazed gave him some fresh air to breathe. Fourthly, although Eutychus is called a young man in verse 9, in verse 12 he is only a boy or lad. That word pais normally covering the years from 8 to 14. Fifthly, Luke does not intend us to attach any blame to the boy for falling asleep during the apostles' sermon, for the impression is that he had a protracted struggle with his sleepiness. To begin with, he was gradually sinking into a deep sleep, or better, grew drowsy. It was only as Paul talked on and on that he fell sound asleep. Some other translations say completely overcome by sleep. And the accident happened. He fell to the ground from the third story and he was picked up dead. The New English Bible, picked up for dead, hinting that he might not really have been dead, is definitely wrong. Luke declares that he was dead. As a doctor, he could vouch for it. One can imagine the confusion which then took over as everybody tried to run downstairs. Paul at once suspended his sermon and himself went down. Then surely, following the precedent established by Elijah with the son of the widow at Zarephath, and by Elisha with the son of the Shunammite woman, he threw himself on the young man and put his arms around him and said, "Don't be alarmed, he's alive." This was not a statement that he was still alive in spite of his disastrous fall, but that as a result of Paul embracing him, he had come to life again. Then he, Paul, went upstairs again and broke bread and ate, sharing in both the Lord's Supper and the fellowship supper, which had evidently not been served previously. Paul also resumed his sermon, and after talking until daylight, he left, according to verse 11. Meanwhile, the people, relatives and friends, one may assume, took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted. And put in a link to the credibility of Luke, something we don't think about if we're coming from a background where we believe in the inherent authority of Scripture. But Luke has credibility even though he's not an apostle and not a prophet. So where does his credibility come from? So that video is on your screen.